Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
I have a special episode today where I take a sort of mid-year look back, talk about some of my favorite books so far for 2025, and then share books that I have coming up for the rest of this year. I'll also talk about the one thing that has surprised me this year in the books that I've read, or the main thing that has stuck out so far. I find it helpful for this project just to take a step back every now and then and kind of look for overall themes or just directions, things that I might not notice just in the individual books, but if I take a step back and think, okay, here's what I read the past 6 months. Were there any themes? Were there any ideas that have really stood out or things that surprised me? And I think it's important in our reading lives to take those breaks every now and then and just kind of take a look back and see what we've been learning, what's been sticking out and how that's impacted our further reading. So I'm in the midst of reading through 200 of the immortal books. I've made a list of 200 authors, and so some of them will have multiple books, some of them will just have one or two books. So it'll be many books, but 200 authors. And I've consulted a number of lists and then came up with my final set of books and authors. And I'm making my way through that list in chronological order. So I started that in 2023. And I expect it to take 15 or so years. And so I'm in year 3 of that right now. Of those 200 authors, I've finished 17 of them. So I started with Epic of Gilgamesh and then found out later there was something older in Enheduanna. So if I'm listing out the 17 in chronological order here, it would be Enheduanna and then the Epic of Gilgamesh. And there's not an author that we know of. And so the next 3 items are not authors, but they're works. The next 4 here. So Epic of Gilgamesh, writings from ancient Egypt, and then I read the Rig Veda from India, the Enuma Elish in Atrahasis, those are from Mesopotamia, that's the creation epic, and then the flood myth. And then I got into the Greeks, I got into Homer, Hesiod, Sappho, Aesop, Confucius from China, and then back to Greeks with Aeschylus, Herodotus, Sophocles, Euripides, Thucydides, Aristophanes, and Xenophon. So those are the first 17 out of the list that I've completed. I just finished Xenophon at the end of June. So right now I've with reading 17 out of those 200, I've only read 8% of the authors on that list, but time-wise, I'm 17% into the project. So I'm a bit behind, and the 17% is figuring 15 years total. So being in year 2.5 of 15, I'm around the 17% time-wise, but I have only read 8% of the authors. I am kind of front-loading this project where I'm reading a lot from the Greeks. I ended up reading all of the tragedies, all of the surviving tragedies, and even some of the fragments. So I knew at the start here, I really wanted to dig in, especially with Homer and these works, just to really know and get to know them well, just because I know that so many of the other authors on that list are going to be referencing Homer. They're going to be referencing the tragedies and things like that. So I think I'll catch up because some of the other authors, there's just one book or 2 books. But I'm fine with this going for a number of years. But I do want to try to keep it around 15 years just because I've got ideas for what I'd like to do after that as well. Each year I try to think of a theme for the books that are on the list for that year. So last year was my big fat Greek reading list, just because everything was from Greece. This year I've called it Greek tragedies, comedies, and philosophy. So the first part of this year I focused on completing the Greek tragedies, and then I got into Aristophanes and the comedies. And then the latter part of this year, I'll be digging into philosophy, Greek philosophy for the first time. So each year I divide my reading year into 5 different segments. And so I start off January and February, and I just read straight through a different version of the Bible. And I've done that 3 or 4 times now, and each time I finish right on the last day of February. And then I take March through June, and I call that my spring semester. And that's where I'm just going to those immortal books and just the next one on the list to just try to read one at a time and make my way through that list. Then in July, the month that we're in right now, I take summer break. And so these are books that have piled up on my to-be-read pile. They're books I've heard about, books that have been recommended to me. Perhaps a friend has written a book, or there's an author we have coming up at Landmark Booksellers where I'm business manager, and I just want to read the work before the author comes. That's where I kind of read those books during July. And then August through November, I go back to the immortal books, and that's called my fall semester. And then in December, I take a winter break and do that same thing where I just kind of read books that have piled up on the to-be-read list. So far for this year, I've read 19 books in total. I'll go through those in the next segment. And so for the rest of this episode, I'm going to talk about the books that I've read this year, and then highlight some of the ideas that have woven their way through these works. I'll talk about the next couple months coming up on what I'm reading. And then in the final segment, I'll cover the one thing, the main idea that has stuck out the most so far this year in my reading. All right, so as I mentioned in the last segment, I start off each year reading straight through the Bible. And so this year I selected the King James Version of the Bible. And I sat down January 1st, started in Genesis, and then read to the end of Revelation. The version I used was, it was just like this huge book, and it was illustrated by Barry Moser, both illustrated and designed by Barry Moser. So it was just a beautiful Bible. The layout, like you could tell a lot of thought was put into the design, the font, the structure, everything. And then there were just a ton of illustrations from Barry Moser, and he does wood engravings and prints. And so there are just these beautiful prints throughout the Bible. And they really brought things to life, because you'd be reading about a person, or you'd be reading about a story or situation, and the illustration would be right there, and it would be of that. And I still have some of those in my mind. Like if I close my eyes, I can see some of them. There's one with Jonah and the whale. Like it's right after Jonah's been spit out of the whale, and you just see this expression of like, oh. It's just brilliantly captured. And so I really enjoyed that. But more so, I loved the King James Version of the Bible. If you're reading other works that in English that quote the Bible, oftentimes it's going to be quoting the King James Version of the Bible. We have so many sayings and phrases that have come down to us from that translation that it's so much a part of our culture that we almost kind of miss it. And in fact, I was reading one part where the translation of a part, it was like, oh, this is a hymn, but I'd never noticed it before because the other translations would have it differently. But then this is like the exact hymn that we sing in church, and so that was kind of fun to do that. Thinking that the King James Bible might become my main one going forward, but we'll see. I was so intrigued while reading it that I decided to add a book at the end called God's Secretaries, and that's about the making of the King James Bible and the translation and the translators. And that was a fascinating look. This happened in the early 1600s, and just the team that was assembled, very, very interesting to read about that. So if you have any interest in the King James Version of the Bible and how it came together, God's Secretaries is a good book to get you there. So I've got that list of 200 authors for the Immortal books, and I was looking at March of this year. I expected to get back into the Greek tragedies. I still had some by Euripides that I hadn't read from the year before. So my plan was in March to get into Euripides. But I just glanced back at my list and I realized that I'd skipped over Confucius. So just time-wise, Confucius would have been just slightly before the Greek tragedy writers, even before Aeschylus. And I'm basing it there by the year that they passed away. So Confucius was right before Aeschylus. And so instead of continuing on in the Greek tragedies in March, I decided to pick up the Analects by Confucius. And I picked up the book, and it's rather like the Analects part is rather short. There was an introduction and then notes at the end, so that made the book a little thicker. But if you're just looking at the Analects, I thought to myself, okay, this will just take 3 days. And I ended up spending the entire month of March with Confucius. So I read it through the first time and just realized I was missing a lot. And I wanted to get another translation because there were some word translations in the first version I read that I didn't understand the idea or the concept, and so I wanted to see how someone else translated it. So I ended up reading 2 different translations, and then I read a book about Confucius, and that was very interesting. And that was done by An Ping Chin, who is one of the translators of the versions of Confucius that I read. So my one thing from this year so far that I'll share in the next segment actually came from Confucius. And so I enjoyed getting into that. My expectations going in were that it was a religious text, and it really was not that. It was more of a philosophical text, but really for the purpose of Confucius preparing young men to work in the government. And so it was more of like a dialogue. So the analects are kind of like statements, but it's not statements as in you go to the book of Proverbs and it's wisdom statements. It's not like that. It's more of like a dialogue where Confucius is talking to his followers, and the followers will ask questions. Confucius will respond, or Confucius will kind of raise a question and then see what his followers think and then kind of answer from there. So I got a lot out of that. I enjoyed that. I ended up spending a month instead of 3 days, but it was well worth it. Then I got to April, and again, I'm supposed to be back into the Immortal books, but at Landmark Booksellers, where I'm business manager, I also book all the events. And we had some just incredible events coming up to where I wanted to read the books before they got there. So before the authors did their event. So in April, I kind of took a slight break from the Immortal books to read 3 books in particular: Free Speech, The Great Gatsby, and then There's Nothing Like This. So Free Speech, obviously about free speech. That was a great event, a fantastic book. Great Gatsby, we obviously did not have the author in for that, but I lead a monthly reading group, and it's called Short Great Books. And Great Gatsby was the book for April. So I wanted to make sure I had prepared well for that session. And then There's Nothing Like This is a book about the business rise of Taylor Swift. And we had the author, Kevin Evers, come in. He works for the Harvard Business Review, and just a great writer. And it was really interesting because people in the Nashville community came to the event, people who actually had worked with Taylor Swift. And so the discussion was really interesting. But the book was just, my background is business. I studied business in college and familiar with the case study platform of presenting a problem with a business and how they went about solving it, but then also leaving it ambiguous enough to where you can kind of look at it and like, what would I have done in this situation? And so the book kind of had that feel, but just going through Taylor's career from start to finish. And she just kind of has a natural business sense and business acumen. And so to see this business writer kind of go through that career and look at decisions, it was really interesting. So that was April. In May, I went back to Euripides. I had planned to start Euripides in March, but I read these plays by Euripides in May: Suppliants, Ion, Helen, the Bacchae, and then I read fragments of Euripides, and I had Philoctetes in there as well. But Philoctetes, in May, that's the Short Great Book, so I added that in there to read, and that one's by Sophocles. Euripides did write a Philoctetes play, but it does not survive. So I actually read about that in the fragments by Euripides, but that is a play by Sophocles. And so that's what I read in May. And then in June, I got into the Greek comedies with Aristophanes, and then I closed out with Greek history by Xenophon. And so my plan going into June was actually to read all 11 surviving comedy plays by Aristophanes, but I got into them and I did not enjoy them. So I think part of it was kind of like genre shock, in the sense of the tragedies are these like magisterial plays, and there's like just the extremes of emotions and actions and like, but there's honor within them. They're elevated, like they're just incredible and what you learn from them. And yes, they're tragic and there's horrible things going on, but it's like, there's just a gravitas to these tragedies. And then you get to the comedies and it's like, all of that is out the window. There's fart jokes and you feel like you're going to a play put on by a college fraternity. And I know there's like, they're funny, they're humorous, but like they're also very, there's a sense of just degradation in the plays themselves. They're making fun of people who would have been at the play. Clouds, the first one I read, makes fun of Socrates, and just like brutally though. And so I kind of wonder, like, are they laughing during this? The people that are getting made fun of, like, that would be my worst nightmare, to go in public and then be around like 10,000, 20,000 people, and for someone on the stage to just call you out and make fun of you because you're bald or you're dumb, or like, that would just be horrible. But apparently they liked this. And so I was intrigued in that aspect of it, of just the amount of freedom of speech that you had to have to allow for this kind of thing was amazing. It blew me away. There were limits to that. You couldn't talk about the gods in a certain way and that, but like, they're just blasting people and like blasting the leaders of Greece and Athens. And so it was interesting, but yeah, just the, they're not like elevated things, but so the first four I read, I was just like, I don't like these. But then I read The Frogs, and that one was cool because it pits Aeschylus versus Euripides in the afterlife, and who's the better poet, who's the better tragedy writer, and just going back and forth between them. It was really interesting. It's almost like, the tragedy plays are going on at this time, and it's almost like a criticism of those, but within a play, and there's humor in it. So the Frogs actually kind of got me back on the comedy bandwagon, but I stopped at 5. And so instead of reading all 11, I stopped at 5, and I might come back to these later on, but I just didn't, I didn't want to read any more of the comedy. So I left it at there, and then went into Xenophon to finish off the Greek history. So I'd read Hellenica by Xenophon last year, and then I had 2 more that I wanted to read by him. So I read Anabasis, and then I read Cyropaedia. So the Education of Cyrus. And so those two, the first one, Anabasis, is a battle in Persia that Xenophon actually was a major player in. And so he writes about it from that aspect. So that one's, the historical aspect of it is a lot stronger. The Education of Cyrus is kind of a fictionalized account of Cyrus. And so Cyrus actually passed away 160 years before Xenophon would have written that. And so there's not like a firsthand account like there is with Anabasis. But what it kind of seemed to me at the end is like, if you were to take George Washington and just like write all these great things about him, but you don't know if they're true or not, but it maybe matches with his life and what you do know about him, but you're just kind of making stuff up of like his early life or his early childhood. And you can make up all these stories, and then, okay, this is what led to George Washington's life and what he did in life and all that. But like, you don't really know. And so that's kind of what it seemed like. There's some fantastic information of it in it, but it seems more of like a moral treaty or just like a novel. It almost had a feel of a novel. And so I enjoyed it, but at first I went into it thinking like, oh, is this a historical account? And it's really not. There are historical objects in the book, like battles and that really took place, but the story itself is more of a fictionalized account of his life. So just kind of going back and looking over that spring semester of reading, the thing that strikes me about the tragedies is, and the thing I like the best, is that you see these people in Greek mythology, you see them over time. So like with the example of Philoctetes, there's Neoptolemus is in that play, and Neoptolemus is the son of Achilles. He goes on to commit some atrocities during the Trojan War. He kills Priam while Priam is holding onto the altar. Like, it's just something you don't do. But we're presented with Neoptolemus before all that in the play Philoctetes by Sophocles. And Neoptolemus is presented as kind of pure, honorable, like he wants to do the right thing. He doesn't want to lie. But you see, like, what's the trajectory that led to him doing these atrocities in the Trojan War? And so that's kind of one of my favorite things about Greek tragedies is you're seeing these people in Greek mythology at different points in their life. And the tragedy writers are kind of riffing off the story. They might be making it up, or they might be taking aspects of the story that are known. But it's just so fun to see, okay, this is this person, this is Odysseus before the Trojan War or after the Trojan War, or this is this person before or after. And I love that aspect of it. And just, you get a long thread of someone's life. The other thing I really love about the tragedies is that they riff on established stories. So there's a couple that kind of give like an alternative history of what happened. There's one with Iphigenia where she doesn't get sacrificed by her father Agamemnon. That one's really cool. And then there's one about Helen, and that one's by Euripides. Helen is whisked away to Egypt instead of being kidnapped, and it's like a body double of hers that is the one that's kidnapped and taken to Troy, which sets off the Trojan War. And you're just kind of thinking like, first off, it's an incredible accomplishment for a tragedy writer to do that, where everyone knows the actual story, but to write it in such a way of like, what if this happened? What if it happened this way? And so I love that. Like we see that all the time in our movies and in stories where it's like, what if this happened instead? Or here's an alternate ending. I even think back to like the Choose Your Own Adventure books when I was a kid, where you could just, based on different pages you skip to, it would be a different ending of the story. The thing I love about Greek history is it's almost like you're getting a glimpse, because if you're taking this chronologically, you're seeing Greek ideas in Homer. You're seeing philosophy in the tragedies and in Homer, and obviously I'll be getting to the Greek philosophers next, but you're seeing these ideals that the Greeks have, but then you're seeing these ideals placed in real politic and in real life, and how do they handle these? And if there's this aspect of civilization being about dialogue and all that, but then you see the Greeks just go and annihilate a people in war. So like it's kind of like the working out of these ideas in real life, and it's really interesting. So that's one thing I love just about reading Greek history by actual Greek historians is to kind of see in real time this play out. So I'm in July now, my summer reading month, and here's what I have on the list. I've got a kind of a combination of books that I'll be reading as well as books that I'll be listening to. So for reading, the first one, and the one I'm reading right now, is The Library of Ancient Wisdom. And this one is about the Library of Ashurbanipal. And we got the Epic of Gilgamesh out of there. We got just a ton of works from Mesopotamia from there on these clay tablets. And she describes at the beginning how we got them. And when Nineveh was attacked, the building where these tablets would have been set on fire. And what's amazing about that is like the fire actually hardens these tablets to where we were able to discover them just 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And so we've got these tablets, they're sitting in museums. A lot of them are still waiting to be read, but she kind of goes through cuneiform, in these tablets and what we're learning from them. And it's a very interesting book. I'm probably a quarter or a third of the way in and just loving it. Next up, I have The Idea Machine. That's by a friend of mine, Joel J. Miller. He's an author here in Franklin, Tennessee. And this is a book about the book, the book about how books came to be, the format we have them in, and just kind of through history. And so I started reading that earlier this year, but I'm going to set aside the time this month to read straight through. After that, I'm going to do An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic. This is by Daniel Mendelsohn. We had him in at Landmark Booksellers in June. And so he just translated the Odyssey, but then he's got this other book that he wrote before he did the translation of the Odyssey. And this is about his father and him. They do this trip, but his father took his course on the Odyssey as an old man. And so just... It's like they're about their life, but it ties the Odyssey in throughout. And I started reading it. It's really interesting. So I'm going to finish that one. After that, I've got the Logic of Tragedy by Philip Velicourt. He does some of the translations I've read for some of the Greek works. And this one's about Aeschylus and the Oresteia in particular. And so I'm just kind of nerding out and getting deeper into that. My Short Great Books reading group book for July is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, and so I'll be reading that as well. I'm going to try to, if I still have time, I'm going to close out with Myths from Mesopotamia, Creation, the Flood, Gilgamesh, and others. So these are works from Mesopotamia. As you can see, I'm really interested in the ancient Near East. Mesopotamia, works from there. I loved Gilgamesh. So I just kind of want to read this book that has a lot of these different stories and introductions to them and all that. For the books that I'm listening to, I'm listening to books about music. And so the first one I'm doing is John and Paul. And so that's John Lennon and Paul McCartney, A Love Story in Songs. And I'm a little over halfway through that. It's fascinating. There's 40 plus chapters, but each chapter is a song title, and the author goes through and just talks about how the song came about, who started it, like how did they choose the beat, the instruments, the lyrics and all that. It's so interesting. And so I'm kind of switching back and forth between listening to the song and then listening to the chapter about that song. I'm not very familiar with the Beatles, so I know their songs just from hearing them my whole life, but like I was never like a fan, so this has been really interesting just to kind of get the story behind a lot of these songs. Then I'm going to listen to Surrender by Bono of U2. My wife listened to that one and loved it, and I've heard good things about that one. And then last, I'm going to listen to Roots and Rhythm, A Life in Music by Charlie Peacock. He is a local producer here. He's produced some of the music that I've loved during my life, and we had him at Landmark Booksellers last year as well, and so I want to listen to that one. In August, I usually will be back into the Immortal books, but we have Alan Levi, the author, coming for an event in early September, and so I'm going to spend most of the month of August just preparing in the sense of reading his book, Theo of Golden. He has another book, The Last Sweet Mile, that I've not read. I'm going to listen to podcast episodes that he's been on, and then that is the book for August for the Short Great Books reading list, which I would love for you to join. You can join that Short Great Books reading list just by becoming a paid subscriber here on Substack. Got plans for $5 a month, $99 per year, or $500 per year. So if you're at any of those levels, you'll get notified of the book and for that month, and you'll get the Zoom link to discuss. But I'd love to have you join that. But August, we're going to be discussing Theo of Golden. Incredible book. I loved it. So glad that we booked Alan Levi. We booked him at like the main theater in Franklin, Tennessee here, and it was so popular, sold out in 3 days. So we put another time. So there's two times. The second event at 3 p.m. is almost sold out. So if you're around the Franklin area on September 6th, which is a Saturday, check out landmarkbooksellers.com if you're interested in getting tickets to that. So August, I'm going to be spending a lot of time just reading and getting to know Alan Levi in preparation for that September event. And then I will start my fall semester after that. The fall semester then is going to start with the Greek philosophers. So I'm starting with Plato, and then I think I'll probably be in Plato the remainder of the year. If I finish Plato, I would then go on to Aristotle, but I'm guessing Aristotle will be kind of spring semester next year. So that's what I've been reading, what I've got coming up. And in the next segment here, I'll highlight kind of my main idea that has stood out from this year of reading. All right, so for my one thing here, the main idea that stood out through my reading so far this year, and it has to come from Confucius. I came across this idea of where Confucius says he ties all of his knowledge together with a single thread. And I was just thinking about that in terms of the reading life, and is there a way to help me remember what I read? And just this idea of a single thread has been such a strong one. I've talked about it with a lot of people, and they've gravitated towards it. So I've been exploring that idea and thinking about it a lot. So that's my one thing so far from this year. But I loved the Greek tragedies. I spent a lot of time with them, read all of them. After just expecting to read 2 per tragedy playwright, but I ended up reading all the surviving ones. The Greek tragedies are something very special. Obviously, you got to start with Homer. So much of the tragedies, so many of them reference Homer, reference the Iliad, the Odyssey, the stories therein, and just kind of Greek mythology in general. But Greek tragedies are you really got to spend some time with them. They're great. And they take like 2 hours to read one play. So it's not a lot of time, but they're excellent. So had a lot of fun with that. I'm glad I read Histories over the last 3 years by Herodotus, Thucydides, and then Xenophon. So that's been great. Herodotus is still my favorite. His view of history and just his intellectual curiosity are contagious and delightful. So if you get a chance to read Herodotus, please do that as well. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I will do a recap episode at the end of this year, just kind of covering the entire year of the reading life. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. Just kind of keep if it's more of like a personal one, you can do it to email. But if it's just kind of more a general comment, please do that on Substack, because then other people will see it. We can get a conversation going. I would love that. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, at Books of Titans on either one of those. And check out my website. I've got the Substack where it's booksoftitans.com, but I also have a website, books.booksoftitans.com, where I share all of my reading lists from 2017 to now. You can see my Immortal books list. You can see reviews for all the books that I've read, just kind of some helpful tools there. And then on the Substack, that's where I do the podcast, but I also do an article each week on Tuesdays. And some of those are just ideas to help you read better. So be sure to subscribe on Substack as well. Again, booksoftitans.com. I'll be back next week to discuss a book or something else from 2025 here. So until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.